you may have read one of the assigned readings, which, thank you. You may have read one of the assigned readings, which basically talked about, the fact that in climate mobility studies, part of the issue has been that researchers sort of started as if there were no prior theories of migration out there. And often they began from a kind of neo-Malthusian viewpoint, which is that environmental factors are the reasons why people are migrating, and that's all we really needed to look at. And obviously, we know today, and I think we knew then as well, that that's not enough. So let's take a look at this outline, which has to do with this, first looking at the scientific study in demography of migration, then looking at migration theory and climate mobility, and then finally, I want to get back to this topic of climate justice, which was begun to raise earlier, and see how it relates to theory as well. So population mobility is a multidimensional and multifaceted phenomena with multiple levels of analysis, from individuals to households, to communities, nations, regions, and globes, embedded in social and other contexts, and further defined by temporal and spatial dimensions. So that's what makes it somewhat complex to study. So how do we capture this multifaceted character of mobility and migration? So one way of capturing it is just to say, if you've crossed a national border or an administrative unit of any kind from one state to another in India, then you've migrated. That's one way of defining it. There have been other efforts to define minimum distances for migration. So if you lived on the border between Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, for instance, and you cross 2 kilometers from one side to the other, is that really migration? You could say that's just moving your house a little bit. So there have been other efforts to define things. IOM defines migration as the movement of a person or group of persons either across the international border or within a state. It is a population movement encompassing any kind of movement of people, whatever its length, composition, and causes. It includes migration of refugees, displaced people, economic migrants, and people moving for other purposes, including family reunification. One thing that this doesn't really incorporate is the temporal dimension, which I think is lacking. So if you're moving, we talked about, well, yesterday I was doing a separate lecture, but I talked about seasonal migration in India, and I'll present a little bit of that tomorrow. If you're moving seasonally, is that really migration? Yeah, it is. It's a form of migration. It's called circular migration, but people are not leaving, say, to go permanently to another location. So there's also in the literature a growing kind of list of different types of migration that are being described. Distress migration is considered to be a movement made in conditions where the individual and household perceive the only viable livelihood option for moving out of poverty is to migrate. Such distress is usually associated with lack of livelihood options, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of the notion that you're not really you're not voluntarily migrating, you're moving because of some stress on your life. And there's a big debate in migration literature on what constitutes free will and the decisions. Like one person's choice to move could be someone else's. Like things are really so bad, they've gotten so bad, I need to leave. There's no other option. So volition is essentially underlying some of these concepts. Environmental migrants are generally people who move because of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions. So they're obliged to leave their habitual homes. Mixed migration is a term that's being used increasingly. And here the idea is that people have different motivations for moving, but they're all moving sort of. So a lot of people are leaving different countries of the world, and they're crossing as undocumented migrants into the United States on our southern border. But there's really a mixed form of migration because the motivations, some are Venezuelans seeking basically they want to flee the Venezuelan regime because it's a very repressive regime in some ways, and the economy has completely tanked. Chinese, maybe things aren't so bad in China, but the Chinese are also moving across the U.S. southern border. But in their case, it's because, well, there's been a slight economic downturn, and there's a perception that America is a land of opportunities, and they want to go. So there's this people traveling together with a mix of migratory motivations, and then sometimes there are mixtures of communities migrating in the same direction. So there's spatial and temporal concepts here as well as volition. So Beth Fessel, a colleague of mine at Brown University, has talked about 3 dimensions of migration theory: a spatial dimension bridging the origin and destination areas, a temporal dimension explaining why migration streams begins and continues to grow over time, a volitional dimension of revealing the responses of migrants to the context that produce and change the migration system. So this is sort of one way of encompassing the different elements of migrants. So why does it occur? Why does migration between 2 places continue and maybe grow over time? For instance, South Asian migration to the Western Asian region is huge. The number of people moving to the Gulf for jobs and things, and it has grown over time. As people move, more people tend to move and follow them. We'll talk about that in a minute. Data and measurement. The major aspect of migration that separates it from conventional demographic approaches is the intrinsic importance of geography, meaning location. Handling time also raises some concerns for discerning whether an event has taken place or not. The measurement and analysis of migration also involves some specialized concerns in data collection and management. So it's unlike births, deaths, marriages, usually happens once, and you can locate the person in time and space. Migration is happening throughout a person's life course potentially, and you might measure at every census migration occurring in the 5 years before, but that gives quite a bit of temporal depth to, you don't know, there's uncertainty in when that person actually relocated if they say that they migrated in the last 5 years. It's even worse if you just use the censuses and every 10 years record that people have been moving. You don't know when they moved during that time period. So then there's kind of these flows of people and potential counterflows of things like remittances, money being sent back home. So there's a place of origin, a place of destination, and a flow between them. That's clear. But beyond that, there's also these counterflows. So as I said, flows generally are related to some administrative division. So you've got people moving from different administrative areas between them. And then this person technically would not be considered a migrant because they move within the same location, the same administrative unit. That would be considered internal mobility. So in an international migration system, there's internal domestic migration and external or international migration. So types of internal include rural, urban, rural, urban, international, cross-border. And these could be in some sense viewed as a progression of different types of migration. A lot of people now in the U.S. are leaving, Los Angeles, and they're moving to the middle of some rural area of Colorado to breathe the fresh air. They don't want to live in a congested area. And urban, clearly is more of a feature of places like India, where people tend to hop between major cities. You've got, anyway, these are all types: international, temporary, forced, voluntary. And then we've talked about the age selectivity of migrants. So typically, the probability of having migrated, in this particular graph in the last 5 years before the census, shows that, disproportionately, like in Chile and in places like Panama, it's the young who are migrating a lot more. It looks like Nicaragua migration, rural, urban, and other types of migration is not very high, even among younger populations. This is the Senegal River Valley, and you get a sense of the fact that long-term migrations, again, tend to heap on the younger age groups. The shorter-term migrations and seasonal migrations are a little bit more evenly distributed across the age range. There's different sources of data to measure migration, census data on migrant stocks, where people lived 5 years before, et cetera. Survey data, where people lived 5 years before. That's a typical question in a lot of demographic and health surveys. Migration calendars is much more detailed, so you could actually sit down with people and collect when the events, like in their life history, they move from one place to another, and you can begin to build up a sense of when people moved. And that's also migration histories. Administrative records include residency permits, like in China. I understood here as well. Yesterday, I was talking to some people at the National Institute for Urban Affairs, and they basically said that I didn't know this, but in India, it's very hard to change your permanent residency. Is that true? If you're a rural dweller, apparently, like, you would be counted in the census based on where your home village is, not necessarily, all right? So that's one element. It's not that people don't move. We know that in China, many people move without the hukou. But what that means for them is that it may throw off official statistics, because the hukou would say, well, you're really still in the rural area, whereas a male may be living in Shanghai or somewhere else. What that means for the it prevents families from migrating generally, because you won't get access to schools, you won't get access to to healthcare and other things, because your residency permit ties all of your benefits, your social benefits, back to your home village. And there's new data sources, including social media, big data, call detail records. Some of you may have an interest in some of these. Someone mentioned to me Facebook data, for instance. They're now being used for migration research increasingly. And some of these have strengths, but you also have to look at the biases inherent in, who's got access to telephones. Not everybody in low-income countries actually uses cell phones. Social media, even more biased, because not everybody's on Facebook. So here's some example of internal migration matrix in Antigua and Barbuda, and it basically talks about in the 5 years from 1996 to 2001, how many people moved from one location to another. So this is sort of a traditional, and these sort of matrices also exist. You can get matrices for the entire world, country to country, and there's a guy named Guy Abel, who spelled A-B-E-L, Guy Abel. He's done some really interesting work trying to harmonize, because these data, frankly, it's a mix of flow data and stock data. And when you're looking at those two types of data, trying to reconcile the stocks and the flows between countries is difficult. So he's used a number of different methods to come up with these stocks and flows. And then you can come up with total net migration. A net migration rate is basically the number of migrants divided by the population. And you get a sense that some parts of Antigua and Barbuda are losing population, and other areas are gaining population, like St. John's rural. So survey data example, migration calendars, rural East Asia. So this is an example of a calendar approach for an area in Southeast Asia, and you get the number of movers and the total number of migrants and moves. And then so you can kind of tabulate over a number of different migration, a number of time periods, the levels of circular migration in this area. This is an administrative example, so it shows how IRS data shows migration between locations. Let's just take an example. So this is in migrants and out migrants. So what happened in 2004, 2005 in New Orleans, Louisiana? Does anyone know? Probably not, but it's Hurricane Katrina was a major event so what you saw was massive outmigration out of New Orleans and massive in-migration into other places, including places like Florida, and then you have some areas. Kings County, New York, is actually Brooklyn, I believe. And so you've seen, during certain periods, out migration out of the area over periods of time because of economic downturns and the like. This is an example of use of cell phone data in Bangladesh. You might have seen this article before, but they use cell phone data to understand movements of populations just prior to cyclones. So a cyclone warning occurred, and did people move out of the area to get to a safer place? Some of these would be like chars in the on the kind of Ganges Delta, very low-lying areas, and the idea was that people should, in principle, be leaving those areas. Direct methods are based on explicit questions such as place of birth, place of previous residence. Move-ins are estimated by comparing the location of an individual in 2 points in time one and time zero. It may not be possible to know other movements during the interval between the two dates. So like I mentioned, if you measure what happened in the last 5 years, did you move anywhere, you're going to only generally capture one movement, not multiple movements. Indirect methods, you can look at the residuals. So this is an example that I mentioned of using the population balancing equation, where you take the population in time one and take the population in the period before that, and you look at natural increase plus net migration. But you can back out net migration by taking the population change and subtracting out natural increase. We did this actually on a fairly large scale for this project for the UK Foresight report on migration and global environmental change, and ended up publishing some of the results here in this journal article. What we wanted to do and what we did eventually achieve is getting a map at a 1 kilometer basis of net migration for every 1 kilometer grid cell globally. But all we had in hand, the only thing that we had at the time we started this project, was population by decade. So we had 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. At the time we did this work, 2010 was actually a projected population based on 2000 census data. And what we did was we measured, and I'll show how we did it in a moment, but what we were asked to do by the UK Foresight Project was estimate the number of net migrants per decade from 1970 to 2010. So this is the first decade. The next one is 1980 to 90. You can see the beginnings of a fairly large migration out of rural areas of India towards cities, out of Western China towards the coast. It accelerates in the 1990s, and then in the 2000s, it sort of evens out a bit. And this is partly based, we didn't have the 2010 census data at the time we did this work. So the approach was, as I mentioned, to take the population balancing equation and use that to calculate net migration. And what we had was population growth. It was easy for us to subtract the population grids from 1970 to 1980. So, 80 minus 1980 minus 1970 gives you the population change per pixel, right? That gives you the total population change. But what we needed was to remove from that what we estimated to be the net natural increase. Because if you remove the natural increase, the burst minus the deaths in that pixel, then you can get the net migration. So it's an indirect estimation approach. So we could have just used country level rates of natural increase and applied those country level rates of natural increase, births minus deaths, to the whole country. But that wouldn't have given us any sense of where natural increase might be higher. Where in most developing countries would you expect natural increase to be highest? No, I'm actually just referring to, I'm sorry, the parts of the country. So would it be more rural or more urban? Yeah, rural areas we see much higher, right, natural increase than urban areas. So we actually compiled as many rates of these are crude birth rates and crude death rates. So that's births per thousand and minus deaths per thousand. And we were able to look at, so we got the rate of natural increase by taking the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. And what you see is if every country had basically equal levels of birth and death rates across the whole, if they were equal everywhere in the world, they would be all around an identity of one, right? Birth dates and death rates basically equal to each other and balancing out. But what we actually found was that there was much more variation in the crude birth rates and death rates. So the ratio of urban, I'm sorry, this is a little bit, the graph here is showing the ratio of urban to rural rates of natural increase. So if they were equal across a whole country, you'd expect them to be equal to 1, right? The ratio of the one to the other would be 1. And so what you actually see is the ratio of rates of natural increase in some parts of the world, limited parts of the world, are actually higher in urban areas than in rural areas. But for most of the world, they're higher in rural areas than they are in urban areas. So we needed to create basically a grid on a 1 kilometer basis globally of rates of natural increase that we could then multiply by the population to get the change in population in that decadal period due to natural increase. And to do that, we collected as many data as we could get on rural and urban differences in rates of natural increase. And we compiled those crude birth rates and crude death rates for 5,000 country year observations, and we imputed the remainder using 2 different statistical packages. One was MI and the other was Amelia. And so we worked with statisticians to do that. And what you see basically is in some countries, there's the rates of natural increase were lower for urban areas. Let me just make sure I'm right about that. So this is China. So rates of natural increase were lower in urban areas than in rural areas. But in the U.S., it's the opposite. Actually, the urban areas have a higher rate of natural increase than the rural areas. So we were able to use this relationship in a generalized relationship. We just created a linear, basically regression. And depending on your level of urbanization, the degree of urbanization, the population density in essence, we were able to calculate we were able to impute, I should say, the rate of natural increase for that particular grid cell. So here again, the approach was we needed rates of natural increase that varied subnationally, and we just took urbanization in a sense as a proxy, but we used the actual differences in the rates between urban and rural populations in the country to impute the level of rates of natural increase. So finally, we came up with this. We were able to subtract out the rates of natural increase on and basically the population increase that was due to natural increase, and from the difference between the 1980 or in this case the 2010 and the 2000 census, And we were able to come up with these maps of natural increase. The method has been replicated by other groups, but it just shows that you can do some kind of interesting things when you understand the relationships between the demographic variables. One kind of interesting, this is a parenthetical note, but it's about what we see about the change in population due to net migration in different parts of the world. And for dryland ecosystems, we see for every region, Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Oceania, we see declines in or negative net migration, meaning people moving out, often very high levels in China, especially, but also in India and other countries. But in the US, we have a counterfactual with people moving into dryland ecosystems, and that's a net migration largely due to amenity migration. People like those dryland areas in the southwest US and in California. The same is true for mountain ecosystems, massive outmigration over each decade in Asia from mountain ecosystems, and a lot of migration into mountain ecosystems in the US, so we are the outlier. Canada maybe also as well in that case. What you do see consistent across the globe is a lot of migration into coastal areas. So everybody seems to want to live near the coast. Those are areas of economic dynamism. So that's just an interesting sort of side note on how to use available data to produce estimates of net migration. Like I said, that particular approach has been replicated now by 2 different groups with some slightly improved refinements to our earlier method. Rates show the relative frequency of a type of migration or mobility. So this is an example of a rate. Residential changes in area over a period of time with MI being what again? Minus period population of the area. So I should have looked at this slide earlier. I'm sorry. I don't remember what the MI stands for. But you can look at rates of migration based on essentially the levels of population that exist in the area. And so this is net migration per 1,000 population by country and territory. And it shows areas where there's very strong negative net migration out and positive net migration into different countries. This is sort of stands out here. Which country is this? Does anyone know? Venezuela, good. Yeah, so Venezuela, as I mentioned, has seen political crises. These countries here, I think South Sudan, and I think that Central African Republic have seen massive, it's coming back up, massive levels of outmigration due to conflict for the most part. All right, so that's all. How do you measure migration? Let's talk now about migration theory. And the theory answers questions like who, what, why, when, where, and when. This is a paper that you have been assigned, and some of you may have read it, for which you are to be commended. But it's a paper that talks about migration theory in the context of climate mobility. And it basically, we say that migration theory in general helps to contribute to our understanding of who migrates, why they migrate, the types of mobility they employ, what sustains migration streams over time, and why they choose certain destinations over others. So at a most basic level, I really like this guy, Jürgen Carling. So if you ever have a chance to read any articles by Jürgen Carling, I find him one of the most helpful theorists. He's really the father of what we call aspirations and capabilities, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But Jürgen Carling, by the way, when did we start the lecture? Does anyone remember? No. Was it 12? Okay, close to 12. So Jürgen Carling says, ask the basic foundational question upon which all theory is really based, or all theory is trying to come to some understanding of this, is why do people migrate? And he basically, in a very commonsensical approach, says, well, people migrate for reasons under which they are admitted as immigrants or asylum seekers. So if you know that you can go to the US and claim that you're a Christian and you're being persecuted by some other group in your country of origin, you'll have a higher probability of getting admission into the United States than if you claim that you couldn't get a job or whatever. So people often adopt those reasons for migration, and then that becomes their narrative. I moved because of this why, even though economics or other things may have been underlying that. They also move for reasons that are socially legitimate. So in certain cultures, it's okay to say you move for educational reasons or something, but it might not be so good to say that you couldn't get along with your in-laws. You hated your mother-in-law. You just wanted to get out of that area, right? So let's just be honest. People give lots of reasons, and if you go to someone and you ask them in a social science survey why they moved, they're going to give you a reason. Well, you better understand that there may be socially acceptable and not so socially acceptable reasons for leaving. For instance, if you're a young Ukrainian male and you happen to leave Ukraine around 2021, do you think you're going to say, I left because I wanted to flee the conflict and avoid being drafted? Yeah, that's not really socially acceptable. In the Ukrainian community, you'd be viewed as what are you, a traitor? So again, you need to kind of take these things into account. So they might, they say, well, I have a job that's vital and important and I need to survive in order to support my mother who's 85 years old and, whatever. And so those are things that are socially legitimate. Another reason is because the sum of push and pull factors in favor of migration. And one of the things I like about Carling is a lot of sophisticated, really highly intellectual people say push-pull model. Going back to, Lee, who was one of the fathers of the push-pull, and we'll look at that in a second, that's just complete nonsense, and, we should discard that in favor of much more theoretically complex explanations. But he comes out and says, well, actually, yeah, there are reasons people are pushed out of certain areas, maybe economically deprived areas, and are pulled to more vibrant places. And let's just be honest that there's often that push and pull does in fact play a role. He talks about aspirations and the ability. So we're going to talk about aspirations and capabilities more in a moment. He talks about opportunistic reasons. My cousin, he was going. He said, I've got an extra seat. Why don't you come along? It's true. It happens like that. And it's like in many parts of the world, it's like, well, if I don't leave, I may miss my opportunity, and I better go, either because they choose to or because they are forced to. And this is again getting to volition, because they see migration as either intrinsically or instrumentally valuable, meaning migration can become an end in itself. That's captured in some surveys when you ask the question, did you leave in part because of adventure or a sense of like expanding your horizons, right? This idea that many of us have, I had as a young person. I went to the Peace Corps because I wanted to see the world, right? I didn't want to just be stuck in an office somewhere in Boston or New York. I wanted to go out and see things. So that was a reason for me to, quote unquote, migrate, I guess, over to Mauritania. And then another is just to lead a normal life, which I find very interesting. He gives examples of quotes from surveys and stuff where, if you talk anecdotally with people that say, well, we left because, everybody was having vacations and like, that's just a normal thing, right? To have a vacation, but we never had a vacation in our life. So we aspired to have like a normal life, which is maybe to take a break every once in a while instead of working every day of the year. I want to get away. So things like that, people consider where they're living, they can't lead a normal life. Sorry, so I went on a little bit too long on that one. But so this is an example of work that I've been doing with a colleague who's a demographer, Susanna Adamo. We haven't published this yet, but we hope to get it out soon. And what we did was we compiled all the surveys we could find for Central America and all the surveys that we could find in West Africa. These are surveys of migrants. For the most part, the way they're conducted is a migrant is, you go with your survey instrument and you find the migrant and you say, of these 10 reasons, which reasons would you say that you chose to migrate? And it's not exclusive. So you could move for economic, and you could say, I also move for educational reasons. So they check, and then they sum up all the migrants that have responded, and they come up with some percentage of migrants that have said one reason or another. That's mostly how they're conducted. There are a few migrant surveys where they also say, what is the primary and number one reason that you left? And then they might come back with a second round and say, well, what other reasons would you have? Which actually muddies the waters a little bit. So it's harder to compare those surveys with the other surveys. But what we found was, of course, for almost pretty much every low-income region you're going to find is that economic reasons and pay and often things like sending. This happens to be a difference. So in West Africa, you see a lot more migrants saying they want to send money home, because of social ties. So in Central America, it's not that sending money home is not important, but it is not nearly as important as in West Africa. Again, that's a socially acceptable reason for leaving. I want to send money to my family that's left behind, and people will accept that, and it's sort of legitimate. Or it's considered a legitimate reason. Corruption in governance shows up a lot more in Central America. Violence and insecurity are also much more in Central America, whereas violence and insecurity is, around about 17% here. It's over 22% in Central America. One of the things that's happening in Central America is there's a lot of narco trafficking, so there's increasing disruption of normal life as it were, in that region because of the effect of this huge influx of money. It's also leading to a lot of corruption because government officials are also taking a cut of that huge amount of money. And so it's a very messy situation there. And so that's reflected in a lot of the responses that we get. But what you also find is that the environmental component here tends to be very, very limited. And so we, as climate migration researchers, often want to think that there's a much more importance to the environmental stressors. Migrants will mention things like back to the hurricanes that occurred in Central America. They'll mention things like drought. They're certainly important. And part of the issue may be that they don't necessarily tie the environmental stressor to things like their livelihoods, okay? So they're poor, but they don't necessarily say I'm poor because, in partly because there's been repeated droughts or cyclones in my area. But there's different reasons. So theories are critical for understanding processes we observe in human nature systems. And I said earlier, when we did the causal modeling, that we all carry these models in our head. We all think about things and we all frame things in certain ways, but it just helps to make explicit what we think. It's another thing also because theory, if you're going out to the field, and I've talked to many of you, you have gone out to the field or you're planning to go out to the field. If you don't have a good framing and a clear and explicit framing and theoretical background, it's, you need it in part to shape the questions you're going to ask. But you also have to be careful. So if you go with a gender theory and say everything's about gender and gender, then you're likely to just find everywhere you go, it's the lens that you're looking at everything, and gender is going to be the most important thing. Where it may be, but I'm just saying you have to be open to the idea that there may be other factors other than say, gender in that particular case. So again, it points to a specific location for research. It influences what researchers find. If you, like the common saying is, if you think you're going to find something, you're likely going to, you're going to go out and corroborate what your predetermined idea is. So we should try to use theory as much as possible as ways of kind of broadening our view as much as possible, not limiting it. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the stuff that's been done early on in my climate migration research was very much influenced by this neo-Malthusian view, where um, it, where migrants are hapless victims of the environmental change that's occurring. So there, traditionally, migration theory has been broken into two components. One component is mostly these individualistic kind of theories that are focused on the neoclassical Homo economicus wage utility theory, where you go to the place with the highest wages, but you also have to take into account intervening obstacles and things that might come between you and the ability to achieve that higher wage. But that's the sort of functionalist school. The other school is more structural theories. And you might have heard of the world systems theory that Wallerstein came up with, but their dependency, structuration, dual labor market, all of these emphasize there's an enormous wealth and power differential between the first world and the third world, or the low income. That was the terminology used in the 70s when a lot of these theories came about. But the global south has a low degree of autonomy and suffers from a neo-colonial impediments, which results in poverty. And then the north has high labor demands because of its industry and its service sectors. And so that, even though we tend to restrict migration, we we do need a lot of labor, and so that's the sort of paradox. Aspirations and Capabilities seeks to thread the needle a bit by recognizing individuals to migrate while there are structural factors that impede people from migrating. So a lot of this stuff, though, can go all the way back to the 1880s, much like climate science can be traced to those early pioneers. Ravenstein had this theory, and it makes a lot of sense to even today, that most migrants proceed only a short distance and towards centers of absorption, meaning urban industrial centers. As migrants move toward absorption centers, they leave gaps that are filled by migrants from more remote districts, creating migration flows that reach to the most remote corner of the kingdom. So, I saw that in different parts of West Africa, where even in poor rural areas, there's always someone who is a little better off, maybe a landowner, and they would employ laborers from a neighboring country, and those people would come and work on the fields. Each main current of migration produces a countercurrent. Migrants proceed long distances, generally go by preference to one of the great centers of commerce. So all this still has, some resonance today. This is the push-pull theory, and the idea is that people are pushed out of areas because of poverty or other factors, and they may be pulled because of attractive mix of factors over here, not just jobs and economic opportunities, but maybe services, education, etc., schools, parts of Ethiopia, for instance, they don't even have schools in a lot of, like, at least high school level. You have to go to a larger city or town to get into high school. So people move out of the origin area, they go to the destination area, but there are a lot of intervening obstacles, and those things include distance and costs, policies that might restrict migration, visas, and border controls. In the 1980s, there arose this new notion of new economics of labor migration, where it's not so much a decision. Deciding to migrate is not so much one's individual decision, but rather a household collective decision. The idea is it's a risk reduction strategy. So in the climate mobility space, this is one of the most widely cited theories, because basically what it means is that you've got these benefits, remittances back to the family of origin in the village, remittances to invest in agriculture and other additional livelihoods, so setting up a little shop, fewer household members eating scarce food reserves, and diversification of income together with an insurance risk reduction approach. So if you don't have insurance, this is actually a pretty good bet. It's a popular theory, and it can be coupled, as I mentioned, well, I talked about the various livelihood capitals. It can be coupled with that livelihood approach. Then we had already talked about this, and I'm not going to repeat what I said about the demographic transition here, but just to say that one theory is that there is what's called a migration hump. And the idea is that when you're in very low income conditions, migration is very low. But when you start getting increases in income, you start to see more and more migration till a point where a country might actually start becoming so well off that people don't need to migrate anymore. So this is one of the challenges where, let's just put it this way. So a lot of developed countries are thinking, well, the way to increase the number, to keep people in place and to avoid people migrating to our country is to help develop their economies, and in the area of climate space to help with adaptation and things like that. But theory predicts that if you add $1 to someone's income, the propensity to migrate actually increases by a certain proportion. So, not just $1, but $100 of income may yield an increased probability of migrating up until a certain threshold, at which point people stop migrating. So that's the idea of the migration hump. I already went through all of this before, but these are the different phases of the mobility transition. Some other theories out there are theories of sustained migration. These are theories that basically explain once a migration system is in place, why it perpetuates. So in South Asia, we see a lot of migration to West Asia. And once that began, it got sustained over time as the economies of West Asia became more and more dependent on labor from India, Bangladesh, Nepal. And the families and the social systems in the sending areas of South Asia became more and more accustomed. And I'd love to hear more discussion of this particular phenomena at the end of the lecture. But it's certainly a phenomena that has explained a lot of migration in many parts of the world. And one question for each of these theories is how might environmental factors fit into this? You could see ways in which migration systems could be affected by climate change in different ways by making places more or less desirable to go. Life course analysis is largely limited to the demographic study of migration, and that's really about how migration is more characteristic of certain life stages. I like this concept of imaginaries, and that's really about, in my view, it's about perceptions, cultural norms, and expectations. And it's kind of like, did anyone see this movie? It was very popular. Well, it won a Cannes, and it was even nominated for the Academy Awards. It's called Il Capitano, and that means the captain in Italian. But it was about these young boys in Dakar, Senegal, and they're imagining life as superstar rap singers in Europe. And it becomes a whole it was a motivating factor for them. They needed to get to Europe because they wanted to achieve this dream of being superstars. I like this work very much by Fresnova Flott, because what she does is says, okay, there's these basic theories out there, neoclassical, new economics of migration, structuration, integration, diaspora, etc. But in the middle area, in the very center, is what goes on within people's heads when they're thinking about migrating. And I think there's one more diagram here. So these all emphasize rationalities, whereas these are more in the emotional and cognitive and kind of behavioral dimension. And at the very heart of it is the individual. And these are all things that may facilitate migration. You know, we haven't talked about it, but smuggling networks exist in the world, right? So there are groups that actually actively promote migration and profit from it by charging people. And so social networks, social media, where people who left a country project success, and then everybody who, the young people who stay in the country say, well, they made it, I could make it too. So these are all things that kind of are external to the individual, but within the individual, there's all these things related to their relationships within the family, their desires, their feelings, their imaginaries, etc. So I already talked a little bit about this review of the literature we did on how migration theory was treated in different studies, and that's a bit of the rationale for why we did it. We did a total sample of 75 studies. We broke them down by different types of studies that used different types of data. So we had some that used census and survey data that were for other reasons, but they had questions on migration. We did some where there was just a survey that related directly to migration, and we did some where qualitative field studies were conducted with participant observation or interviews with people who had migrated or families that were left behind. And some of them focused on things like cyclones and extreme heat. A number of them had sea level rise, and others talked about other things like temperature, precip, etc. This was the regional breakdown. What we found was that the most widely used theoretical framing was the new economics of labor migration. And then there are other theories beyond that, environmental migration frameworks, and then neoclassical was an important one, particularly among economists. And we did break it down by different types of disciplines that are doing the study. So sociologists and demographers tend to prefer the new economics of labor migration. Geographers really tend to emphasize other theories, and those theories are listed in the reading that article I mentioned. And then they also like things like the foresight framework or other environmental migration frameworks. And then, of course, economics, they're really happy to work with the neoclassical wage differential type theories. Then you have all these people who are in like totally different fields like computer science and modeling, and they like the push-pull model because computationally it's very easy to talk about numerical measures of push and pull factors in a numerical model. So I think I'll skip this and just see. I think, yeah, we're running out of time. So I mentioned aspirations and capabilities. Here we can talk about, I talked about acquiescent immobility yesterday, but essentially this is over here, and this is essentially people who have low aspirations and low abilities will be in this quadrant. They can't really move. People who have low aspirations but high capability to migrate, these might be people who we consider to be moored in place, meaning mooring like a boat is moored in a harbor, and they really like to stay where they are because they're happy there and they have what they need. And then you have the high aspirations, the people who really want to move and they're aspiring to leave an area, but they're involuntarily immobile, meaning they can't, they have no capability. And then there are those people who want to leave and also can leave because they have the means to do so, and they're the ones who are voluntarily mobile. In this, you can then bring everything together and look at, in a climate change framework, how climate impacts both aspirations and capabilities in different ways. Like in theory, climate change could block your ability to move if you're actually impeded from moving because the road is washed out, or there's some other, at least temporarily, you're unable to leave because of climate-related disasters. But more typically, climate-related factors will affect one's aspirations to go or to stay. And here are some of the potential the responses to each type or category that I mentioned earlier: voluntary mobility, voluntary immobility, etc. I'm going to skip these because we've kind of covered them earlier and they're a little complicated. I want to touch briefly in the last part on climate justice. By the way, when are we supposed to end today's lecture? 1:15, right? Thanks for keeping me on target here. I didn't set my timer, so um, so um, so just one other. So this is kind of ways in which, just to say that there are ways in which climate factors are being brought to bear on theory, and people are using it in different ways. I've already covered the hazard risk framework, but as I said, you take that hazard risk framework and you basically look at, situations in which people are immobile and they're trapped in locations and it increases their risk and therefore it's a bad outcome versus situations where people move but they also get into locations where risks are enhanced and so that's a bad outcome. And the only really good outcome is where you have either successful local adaptation or people move and they move to a better location, a more safe location. I'm not going to go into this so much, but this is sort of talking about voluntary migration versus displacement or involuntary migration, and the fact that sometimes people fail to reach their goals, and so they might go permanently or they might go temporarily, and they go back to their home area afterwards. All right, so let's switch to this topic of climate justice and climate mobility. So this topic obviously can link very clearly to structural theories such as world systems and dependency theory, where these theories tend to put less emphasis on the individual decision making and more on the structural economic factors explaining migration. So, I talked a bit about Wallerstein's theory earlier, and he basically had this idea that there's an unbalanced world economic order divided into core states and peripheral states. The peripheral areas have a low degree of autonomy and face potentially a kind of neo-colonial situation. So the theory suggests that migration flows are motivated by the unequal distribution of wealth between the rich core and the poor periphery. One of the conclusions from that is that international migration is influenced by this historically formed macro forces is inherently exploitative and self-perpetuating and leads to underdevelopment in the migrant source areas. So this is a negative view of migration, which is essentially one which migrants may benefit temporarily. There may be some benefit to the migrant individually or in their household from migrating to another country. To, let's say, from South Asia to UK, let's just as an example. There may be some benefit to the individual and the household, but as a whole, it actually deprives India of brain power, right? That's the brain drain hypothesis. And the remittances that India receives back doesn't compensate for all the other negative impacts. And it's essentially an exploitative system. And part of the argument among people in this is you're happy to take our goods, our natural resources. I was talking to someone about spices earlier, the spice trade, right? It's been important all these years. But you're happy to take our goods, but you won't take our people. And this is one of the complaints that many countries have, I think, legitimately about the world order. So I, mentioned earlier that I have a project that looks in comparison to Central America, between Central America and West Africa. Both of these regions have certain narratives that have been generated about the impacts of climate change on the populations in those areas and in the ways in which, and the strange thing is they take these pictures and for all we know, these people are going to a rock concert or something else, so there's that sort of objectification of people as well in the photography and the choice of imagery. I got taken to task when we were working with the Groundswell Project in the World Bank. Some of the imagery that they chose was similarly perpetuating these ideas, and I think it's something to be really worried about. So this is the Groundswell work that I mentioned just now, but basically, what we were doing was projecting internal migration within countries, but some of that work was, perpetuating a narrative of people, scraping together money to go and to take their chance to get, to get somewhere better. And I think that some of that some of that narrative may need to be questioned increasingly, and we have to think about ways of changing the narrative a bit. What I found in reading deeper on the motivations in places like West Africa is that climate factors are generally one of a mix of things, but they're rarely the most important, and they're very frequently not mentioned by migrants at all. The prominent ones are economic, followed by widespread pessimism about a system that doesn't exist to support them. So we talked about systems already. So economic systems are important, as well, in the way that systems kind of act to keep people in place, in their place. Economically is something that many migrants know intuitively, that they don't really stand a chance of, even with education, they don't really stand a chance in their home country of improving their lot. There's also issues of fear and insecurity in some parts of the world. So in both regions, the poorest generally lack the means to migrate across borders. Some become internal migrants, and some are involuntarily immobile. But another factor is governance issues. So what you see here for the UNDP, they did a report called Scaling Fences on African migrants to Europe. They say the core message from this study is that migration is a reverberation of uneven development, and particularly of a development trajectory that is failing young people, and sends a strong message to policymakers. And so a lot of migrants in this study, for instance, cited the fact that they felt that even with an education, there were so few jobs for them in their country that they and that those jobs typically went to well-connected, better connected elites. So let's take a look at framing climate mobility in a climate justice perspective. And this is one paper that I commend to you if you're really interested in this topic. The author's name is Carmen Gonzalez, and she looks at climate change, race, and migration. And she talks about, takes an explicitly racial justice lens for looking at the topic. And she talks about carbon capitalism, which basically, carbon, the pursuit of fossil fuels has led to, invariably to a lot of tragedies in many parts of the world. The Niger Delta is one example that's experienced this resource curse where it's become increasingly polluted as a result of fossil fuel extraction. And she talks about a slow violence of the unequal burden of extraction, processing, transportation, refining, and combustion of fossil fuels. She further talks about this idea of sacrifice zones. These are zones that carbon capitalism deploys race and racism as techniques of exclusion and control, creating regions that are expendable, geographic regions that are expendable. So there are parts of the U.S. even where parts of Houston, Texas, there's a community, a town called Perth Amboy in New Jersey, and the smell of oil refining and other chemical industries going on in those areas mean that basically, it's only the poorest people live in those areas. Finally, she talks about an abyssal line between those demarcating people who are presumptively entitled to liberty, equality, and autonomy from those relegated to zones of violence and dispossession. So this is really strong language, and if you're interested in the topic, I suggest you find this article. I'd be happy to send it to you if you can't get it. One metric of this is something called the Passport Index. I don't know if you've ever seen this index, but it's basically how much your passport enables you to travel to other countries around the world. And, for the U.S., we've got a very strong passport index. We can go pretty much anywhere, and we're entitled to come and go as we please. We need visas for some countries like India, and but I can get into Europe, no problem. I just get on a plane and I go, and other countries require extensive vetting and visa processes. I was talking to Professor Raman. I invited him to a conference that we had in the U.S. in June, and he said, "Look at it. I don't have the time to deal with the U.S. embassy. It's just too time consuming to try to get a visa for a one-time entry." So this passport index, basically places like Niger, parts of the Sahel, some other countries where there's a lot of violence, the passport index is very, very limited. In other words, you can't enter into anything but maybe a few neighboring countries with your passport. There's also this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR, and so this principle imposes a common obligation of all states to address climate change while taking into account each state's contribution. So under this, in theory, the U.S. should be a global leader on climate, and we're not. We're falling well short of our obligations, but this is another principle. So Carmen Gonzalez ultimately divides up different types of responses, policy responses to climate mobility, based on whether they fall into a national security paradigm, more of a humanitarian response, or a migration management response. The national security one is basically guns and borders, and we're just saying keep people out. Humanitarian response says, oh, we're so noble, we're going to help all those people who are displaced by this disaster or that problem, but it doesn't really address the underlying root causes. The migration management response is much more about, hey, you guys are empowered, this is migration as adaptation, you guys are adapting, you're doing a great job, and we applaud that effort, and it shows how you're really kind of entrepreneurial in your approach to moving. And she sees that as also a trap in a way, because it basically suggests that families and households in the global south should figure out things for themselves. She proposes a self-determination, a just approach, where collective right of displaced persons to self-determination and legal continuity as self-governing communities, and the ability to move. And so she would adopt a more open borders approach to the issues. So I think it's important to think about how the framing of even the policy responses implies certain things. The last few slides have to do with different elements of justice. Perhaps you've heard of these terms: procedural justice, restorative justice, and recognitional justice. What we do in this paper down here that's coming out soon is basically look at each of these justice concepts in the context of migration, and particularly environmental migration. And I think I'll maybe go through these while we take a few questions. But I see we have like maybe 7-8 minutes left, so I can flip the slide in a moment and go to the next one. But why don't we go ahead and take any comments or questions that you might have?
Thank you, Dr. Alex, for your nice deliberation. I have actually a query. Okay, what, in your opinion, to what extent should climate-induced migrants be recognized as refugees under international refugee law? Okay, so
yeah, maybe take one or two more.
Thank you for this info-led presentation. I have few questions that I would like to frame as quickly as I can. The first comes out of this theoretical framework. What I would like to put it in the maximalist versus the minimalist approach. So if I try to go through the literature, in most of the time, what I find that people feel comfortable in writing in terms of minimalist approach, which actually sideline the idea of climate migration or direct. Like one of the example is of Lisa Otto, her chapter in Cambridge Handbook. She works on Maldives and she says like most of the students are taking education visa to other country because of climate change, but they're not actually agreeing to it, but they want to settle down to other places. The second thing is that why is it that we don't consider climate migration as the climate change migration? What I want to quote it here is like you must be knowing about COFA. Compact of Free Association of US with Micronesia, where they take refugee from Marshall Island, where they have tested nuclear for I think 1,072 times, but still they are not being called as climate change migration a migrant. Instead, they are being drowning on that. So that's the other thing. The third thing, like including these things, how do you think it's like when it comes to imaginary, especially to global north, like what I consider in Edward Said terms as imaginative geography, this does securitize, and what only becomes the possible thing is the marginalization and exclusion.
Okay, so that's three questions in one. So I'm going to start with these two, and then we'll keep going around the room. I'm sure we'll have some time too over lunch. So your question, what were the two words? Oh, under the Refugee Convention, yeah. Well, this has been hotly debated and written about at large, extensively. The international refugee agencies like UNHCR and other groups don't want to expand the definition of refugees because it's already what they see as countries like the U.S., for instance, are already failing to adhere to the minimum standard of people leaving their country for reasons of race. Creed, color, some political views and things like that. So they're really scared about opening up what could be a Pandora's box of, and then it's also hard to prove that someone actually, unless they were directly displaced by a disaster, it's kind of hard to prove it in some cases that someone is really moving primarily for climate reasons. But it's mostly legal reasons on the behalf of the refugee organizations. They don't really want to open that up. You talked about minimal and maximal approaches. So I think what social scientists often, I won't say it's a trap, but I would just say that we want to split hairs so much over that we often want to distance ourselves from what is viewed as commonsensical views of things. And so I think there's a little bit of that in the idea that we should just always err on the side of saying that climate factors are not important or are less relevant than other. Now I think they are generally currently today stated in the order that I showed that chart. They often very much are at the tail end of reasons for people leaving. But what we're not really always taking into account is the physical science basis and the future physical, the ways that climate change may dramatically alter habitability in certain parts of the world. You had a couple other. Can you give me a couple more keywords on things? Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know a lot about that. I do know that there's been a compact for a long time. I know that Federated States of Micronesia, there's another Marshall Islands. There's a few that have this agreement. And yeah, I'm sure some people are leaving for climate reasons. And was there one more? Yeah. Yeah, it just perpetuates the problem. So that's a valid comment. Yeah, I saw a hand back here. Did you have your hand? So I'm trying to do it in the order that I saw the hands. So we'll take your question, then I'll go to the front row.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Professor. So I wanted to ask, do you think we can establish climate justice without epistemic justice? So to put it differently, when we often often the climate-induced displacement happens, people do not really phrase it in terms of climate, but other changes, which is generally linked to climate change. When we link it to climate, are we not shifting the blame from social systems to a scientific understanding of cause and effect as an end to all miseries? Through this, are we not keeping the people most affected by it outside the discourse which affects them?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to some of the points I was making earlier in earlier this week when I was talking about the construction of social vulnerability and how we need to look at the economic systems. So I think part of the point you're making is there's a blame shifting that's going on globally, which kind of says climate is to blame for all these problems, whereas it's really the social and institutional structures. But I'm not sure if that's your main point.
I want to say the language of the way science communicates. So it keeps the discourse, the language in which often the common people getting affected by it communicate outside the discourse of science itself. So they can never be part of the scientific discourse because the language is different. So they're
Yeah, well, we do have a different, like I said earlier, we have scientific definitions of some of these terms and then the commonsensical definitions that people employ. So there is a way in which, common understandings are downplayed or deemed less significant. But I'm not sure I'm quite getting at your question. I'm going to have to keep going, though.
Thank you, sir. I have an observation. We fairly talked about climate mobility or climate change induced migration. But when it comes to this, it's mostly a phenomenon of the affluent population. Not necessarily socioeconomically affluent, but physically affluent, demographically of affluent, like the working population or the younger population, or intellectually affluent people, or per se. But there's a fair part of the world population which is probably scattered across the world, which is particularly third world countries, and even in the first world countries, there is a population which is inherently under the effect of climate change, pertaining to the involuntary immobility or acquiescent immobility which you talked about. So sir, this kind of population, it may be some triggered by a socioeconomic factor, or senile population, or people stuck in war zones or conflict areas, refugees, or it may be in the developed world. We see there is especially abled people or people with various comorbidities, dependencies, emotional dependencies, and all of that factors. So when it comes to climate change migration induced risk prone zones mapping across the world, I think as important is the aspect of climate mobility. Similarly, the equally important is the aspect of involuntary immobility, which is the high risk prone population when it comes to bearing the brunt of the climate change. That was my humble submission. Thank you.
Well, you bring up a good point, and I hate to say another journal article, but there is another one that we just published recently that talked about the critical aspect of involuntary immobility, and I'll talk more about that maybe tomorrow.
Thank you, sir, for your nice lecture. Sir, I have a question. You have talked that the climate change impacts subsistence farming. So, sir, in India, we have lots of people dependent on subsistence farming. So, sir, what can we do to reduce this effect?
So they're living on.
Impact of climate change on subsistence farming.
Well, this is something that you bring up and I'll come to you. I will come to you. But tomorrow, what I want to do, we're going to have a nice time to talk about policy issues and policy responses. So what I'd like to do is take the right-hand side of your systems mapping from Tuesday. When did we do that? Tuesday, Wednesday. Anyway, I'd like to take the right-hand side of that. I think it was Tuesday afternoon. And I'd like to look at some of the adaptation options that you've listed in there, and then start turning it around and talking about what would be some of the policy-related responses to that. So, so that would be my goal is on Friday, tomorrow afternoon, is to talk about, well, what do we do about subsistence agriculture? I mean, seriously, what can we do to make it more robust? What are some of the ways that, depending on whether you're talking about, I don't know, we can break it down to different types of production systems, et cetera. But I think that would be a useful use of our time tomorrow.
So, could you give the example of different kind of justice? Like the slides, I just not moved.
Yeah. So, yeah, examples. Well, I think the examples here are so procedural justice is basically about people's ability to access the justice system or change policies and rules which affect them. So if you're a refugee and you're in another country, you have basically zero power over, the rules and the regulations and the laws that affect you. In some cases, migrants eventually develop those capabilities to affect the legal system through political action and things like that in host countries, wherever they may be. But there's elements in which procedural justice affects many people, not just refugees, but also in the U.S., migrants are now being rounded up, herded, and brought into camps and basically sent home, and they have very little control over that policy landscape. The recognition, restorative justice is basically around trying to do reparations for losses and damages that occurred. So it's giving money and compensation. This is the basis for a lot of the lawsuits against the major oil companies, that some of which are taking place in the U.S. and other countries, where there's kind of saying, well, you knew all these years that fossil fuel consumption was going to create all these problems. You've profited handsomely now. Now it's time to restore to us some of the things that we've lost. In terms of climate and migration, climate visa programs would potentially recognize countries' emissions as they allocate visas to incoming migrants. That would be based on a restorative justice rationale. Finally, recognitional justice is basically just saying, look, it's like the Truth and Justice Commission in South Africa after apartheid. It's like, we acknowledge and we are basically saying that as a government we failed most of our population because we had an apartheid system that benefited only the whites. In the same way, there's just the recognition alone of ancestral sites or consideration of traditional people's knowledge systems like trust, reciprocity, responsibility. All those things can be important. Now there's hardly a meeting that takes place. I noticed at the beginning of our seminar, there was an acknowledgement that the ancestral lands of the people upon which this university has been built. We do the same thing in New York and in Columbia University. We say we recognize that this land was expropriated. I mean, it was just taken. Like, there's no way of whitewashing what happened. It was taken from the Lenape people, and we took it and we use it for other reasons. We're not going to be able to turn back the clock and give that land back in every case, but we can at least recognize that that was what happened. This same chapter I mentioned that we're doing has some great case studies in Honduras about some of the things that happen to women and girls, particularly when flooding occurs. And in West Africa, as fisheries have been declining and as the coast is eroding, what people are starting to think about and young people are considering when they consider the potential for migration. So I'll just leave this up in case you want to stay and read it. I think we have to have lunch. We're behind.
Sorry, Dr. Alex sir, for the insightful conversation or lecture on the climate migration theories, and also thank you for the participant for the engaging discussion. So now we invite all you in the Nehru guest house for the lunch, and after lunch please come again over here for the demonstration of the second tutorial. Thank you.